Hello.
There we go. Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah.
All right.
And then we can
You getting that?
All right. Please feel free to start.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to talk, and I'm sorry not to be there with you today. But I'm going back to the earlier part of the prehistoric conversation with the Neolithic, and it's not advancing. Let me just, there we go. And everybody's probably very familiar, too familiar perhaps, with the human skulls modeled with plaster that Kenyon found in Jericho back in the 1950s, and all the narratives we've built up around those. The idea of lineages, ancestors, all associated with increasing sedentism and the need to develop these cults with people settling down in one place and needing a bit more organization in their societies and ways of dealing with rising populations and demographic pressure. And the person who made it all bigger news, I suppose, was Jacques Cauvin, with his book in the 1990s on the birth of the gods and the birth of agriculture, where he talked about a symbolic revolution in the Neolithic. And that really changed the way people saw the Neolithic, where it was no longer just an agricultural revolution, but one where possibly even led by the changes in ritual and cultic behavior. So very relevant to our theme tonight. And of course, it's been picked up extensively since then by people like Ian Hodder in his Çatalhöyük program. Cauvin's own vision was very much one of high gods and worship. He thought these people with their arms upraised were in prayer to a higher god, and that this was part of the revolution. It was a real change in the way people understood the world. People understood their cosmology and so on. One where they actually had to start believing in an external god rather than any former animist or shamanistic belief systems. So we had all these figurines and plastered skulls, and it's important to note that they're actually most of them are from a relatively short period in time. They're from the middle PPNB, this period of just over 1,000 years. And this is also the same sort of period that Cauvin's talking about, the PPNB. So we're quite well into the Neolithic period before this begins. So it's not really something we can see as a sort of a primary causal factor, but it's related to developments that happen a bit later on. They are, of course, crying out for all sorts of developments and interpretations, often quite instrumentalist anthropological things where they use, the whole process of burial, defleshing, skull removal, plastering of skulls, and all these steps and so on are interpreted very much in functional terms as ways of organizing and structuring society, and importantly, something that goes on over a long period, so that you're not looking at a single event, you're looking at a process perhaps of remembering and forgetting over many years. And Ian Kite pointed out that it's not a uniform tradition either. It's present here in the southern Levant, but you have particularly a difference between skulls where the mandible has been removed before plastering and those where the mandible's kept. The removal more common in the south of this dotted line, where, of course, you then get rather shaped faces, which don't really necessarily look that much like the original person, even if the plastering was done while that person was still existing in people's memories. So probably, again, not necessarily ancestors or not necessarily direct representations of specific ancestors. Furthermore, if we go to the south of Jordan and get down to the sort of area we're talking about today, into the arid margins, the southern middle PPNB sites in Jordan, none of them have plastered skulls. They have a rather different set of burial rites. They're all a bit different one from the other. Beda, the one that's best known from excavations from this period, you have burials where people are just being laid inside a building that seems to have been set aside for this purpose. But apart from that designation as the place where you put bodies, they just seem to be being placed there in amongst the accumulating rubbish and trash in the building. Meanwhile, perhaps indicating a different way of trying to structure society, there is one very much larger structure with a very solid floor. So perhaps something used for communal activities where people got together to meet and discuss what's going on in their community. So taking the emphasis away from the skulls and things found further north, and certainly no plastered skulls in this area. Shkaret Mazed, a very short distance away from Beda, again, for exactly the same period, a rather different set of burial arrangements. Here, they had a single large building in the center where most of the burials happened. But here they keep the skulls. They had one stone kist on the site, which they reckon when they first exposed it had maybe 100 skulls in it. So a very large proportion of the population, perhaps, represented in these skulls, but they're not on display. They're not plastered. They just put in the box. Finally, on the middle PPNB, by around the end of the middle PPNB, still at Beda, here we see what's interpreted as a shrine, where we have the standing stone, the basins placed up on end, and underneath the sand, you can't see it at the moment, a sort of crazy paving floor. Interpreted as a shrine, it's slightly outside the settlement, and it perhaps represents the beginning of a separation between sacred and secular. And I should just quickly mention Nachal Hamar, a cave site where various ritual paraphernalia, including decorated skulls, are placed in storage. So where does all this come from? And is it really a revolution? And what's the changes we see? And how can we understand this? And if we go back to the Natufian, the last hunter-gatherers of the Pleistocene, period of about 14,500 to 12,000 BP, we see that they are actually showing some considerable interest already in skulls. And you can see one there from the early part of the period, decorated with a very elaborate shell headdress. And from a more recent excavation at Tilazon Tashtit, we have this reconstruction here of a woman buried with a large number of tortoise shells and various other non-dietary bits of animal, including a bird's wing, I think a leopard's paw, and so on. And that's interpreted as a shamanistic burial, probably the lady herself being a shaman. So very different from Covan's view of what's going on in the middle PPNB. So something quite different happening in the Natufian. There's the beginnings here in the southern Levant of special purpose buildings, we might call them, at Malacha, a building with a plastered bencher running around it. At Shebeka, these very sturdy stone structures, one built on top of the other, heavily over-engineered, quite large, very solid. And at Wadi Hama on the east bank of the Jordan and in the hills, a site with a very large Natufian building and with carved monoliths. So this interest in the southern Levant in special purpose buildings and so on does go back, starts much earlier than Covan's symbolic revolution. But if we turn to the pre-pottery Neolithic A, that fills in the gap by and large in these two periods, and start thinking about what goes on there, what process of change can we see? Can we see something moving between the shamanistic practices that we believe occur in the Natufian to the birth of the gods that Covan saw in the Neolithic? So in the area that we're interested in, sites are characterized by being small. There's massive variation between the sites and within the sites in terms of their architecture. Most of them seem to have communal structures of one form or another. The burial practices themselves are very diverse, and we should always bear in the backs of our minds that these sites are probably still at least partially occupied by mobile people. They're not necessarily fully settled. And this is in contrast to the headline news that comes out of here at Göbekli Tepe in the southern margins of Turkey on the higher Euphrates, where we have these monumental sites, Göbekli Tepe being the most famous, but others beginning to be found and excavated. Or indeed in the West Bank, where you have Jericho with its enormous tower, again associated more and more rather than with defense or whatever, but with having some sort of ritual or social function in the community. But that's not what we have in the southern area. Here, and if you look at the early PPNA, there is one big site at Dra in the Dead Sea plain, just at the foot of the Wadi Kerak, about a hectare, but the others are uniformly 2,000 square meters or less, WR16, that sort of size. And in the late PPNA, the site you can see in the photographs, Zahra 2, 2,000 square meters. And by the time you get to the middle PPNB, the sites are actually even smaller. So we're not looking at a large community with demographic issues or how to deal with a large number of new neighbors who are fixed with you. We're dealing with people who are still a bit mobile and still living in fairly small communities. But there's this thing about diverse architecture. Bottom right is a classic building from Netif Agdud on the West Bank. And there, although it's a rather ephemeral structure, and many of them are rather ephemeral structures, they can perhaps be classified as houses given the similarity one to the other. If you go to W16, which Juan mentioned earlier, down in Wadi Fanan, you can see that we found a settlement with many, many different forms of building. There's no two buildings really that are the same. They've got all sorts of partitions, internal cells, everything is different one from another. And they all seem to be very functionally related. So you've got the storage buildings, granaries, you've got little workshops and so on. So very little sign of actual residential buildings. And if we go up to the large site at Dra, just a quick run through the stratigraphy of one set of buildings there. At the top of this sequence, we've got a communal food preparation area where we've got a mud-walled structure with a ring of posts, presumably holding a shelter up. It seems a very public food preparation area with mortars and cutting slabs being placed inside it. And below that, we've got a granary. We've got several of these with floors raised up on stone pillars, presumably to keep the air circulating, and with phytoliths indicating they're probably used for barley storage. And again, separate from the buildings, they're not incorporated in houses. They seem to be separate public buildings. And by default, some of these stone-walled structures underneath probably residences. So again, diverse architecture and an emphasis on a lot of communal things. And the large communal building at W16, and Juan showed a shot at an angle where you could see people standing at the different benches. This is an overview, and you can see that probably at least 3 tiers of benches, all wrapped over by this mud plaster. And in this phase of the structure, with 2 cup hole mortars either side of the line of a channel that runs through the center of the building, separating it into 2 halves, and very hard not to see this as some sort of communal celebratory or activity going on in here. When we turn to the burials at this point, when we first started, we found underfloor burials and thought we were going to be in the same game as people had reported before. But these have all been opened. Here, the long bones have been rearranged, bones have been taken away and added, and so on. And although there are quite a number of burials in a primary position of these sort of sleeping individuals, there's a huge amount of manipulation of bodies that goes on. Here are defleshed skull segments that have been painted after they've been defleshed. Here's another skull, and in front of it is what seems to be a bag, with material bag, which is partially preserved by its gypsum lining, where long bones were placed in front of the skull. Here we can see a whole sequential deposition where there's a primary burial, but then it's interfered with, more bones are added, and a whole series of skull caps are brought in. A few years ago, I went with Cheryl Makarovitz to excavate a site high up in the Wadi Hassa, and quite different from the other PPNA sites we've looked at, but perhaps explains a bit what's going on with these dead bodies. And it's still a long hike to get up there. It takes many hours as you trudge away from the Dead Sea down at the bottom. We camped on, you can see at the far end of that, the plateau area, that's a late PPNB site. That's not the end of our walk. We had a 45-minute walk up through a very rugged area every day to get to the actual site itself. You can see it on that steep ridge there, helicopter shot from Bob Bewley. You see a very rugged, difficult landscape, not the sort of place you want to be if you're supposedly an incipient farmer. And the site itself quite small, not that many structures across it. This is when we first got to it and were surveying the damage caused by looting and so on. One of the structures we've got is covered with this mud plaster floor, and what you can see here is the locations underneath that floor of a whole series of secondary burials, or certainly not primary burials. And here they are in various stages of excavation. In the center, there's a grey ashes patch, which is one of them, piles of bones, and two others, and one where you can see the skulls at the bottom and long bones in a stone kist. And what seems to have happened is that bones are brought up. Skulls are very carefully arranged at the base of these features. And then on top of that, it looks like a sack of bones is just simply tipped in on top, often representing quite a large number of people, but very hard to give an actual number, as there's a severe underrepresentation of some parts. But the bones at the bottom are very tightly packed, showing complete defleshing before they're there, and some of the ends of the long bones are smoothed from handling. So you can see that before they get there, there's a lot of temporality to the curation. So it is like they're collecting the bones that have gone through a process on another site and then bringing them for a sort of final resting point up to Sharara. They're not put on open display. The skulls aren't used in the same way as the PPNB skulls are. We've no idea if people even knew their identity at this point. They're often placed with a male and a female skull together, suggesting there's maybe some sort of fictive family going on. This is just a still articulated set of bones, showing again that the temporality is that sometimes people weren't necessarily fully defleshed when they were put into the sack to go up to the site. So there seems to be an emphasis on a particular sort of stage of the burial process where they're coming up here with the bodies. And it seems with this mingling of bodies that, again, like much of the architecture, they're emphasizing the community rather than individuality. It's not an ancestor cult or anything like that, or a lineage or a household. I showed you that there were channels surrounding this burial area, and these are pretty deep. And the depth is exaggerated by a very narrow flight of stairs going down to the deepest part of the channel. It twists at the top to make it difficult to get into. You can see a post hole at the bottom left. And there was some sort of superstructure which exaggerated the height and also made you go in this sort of twisted way. Hiding is emphasized again because on the walls of this there were groundstone tools, mortars on one side, large stone basins on the other that were hidden by plaster walls. And if you look at the base of this, you can see that there's a very ashy deposit, and there's actually a whole sequence of very ashy floors. And it seems that this channel was roofed over, and when people were using it, it was smoke filled, just to add to the strange environment you were going into. We find it quite hard to believe that people were doing anything else other than going down to the level that their dead had been buried at. And in some way, this is keeping the communication with these sort of fictive communal representations going on. So it's keeping the idea of the community going. Also, strikingly different from the other sites, Sharara, all of the other PPNA sites in the south of Jordan are in these very striking landscape locations where the sites themselves are on raised positions where they've been quite visible from a long distance, but they're all backed by typically dark volcanic rocks with angular formations. So the whole thing's very visible. Sharara, you can't see it from the Wadi bottom. It's very difficult to find unless you know where you're going and can duck off the Wadi Gorge at the right point. So a very different location. Now, just as we're getting towards the PPNB, this is a late PPNA site, the site of El Hema, excavated by Cheryl, and here something very different has started to happen. The bodies are all individually placed in their own little graves. They're placed in sitting upright. We think it's possible that the skulls might have been peeping out over the top of the edges. They're peeping out over the top, looking down towards down the wadi, further up the Wadi Hassa. And as they collapse, the capstones are removed from the graves. We can see that they've been lifted and replaced. And at that point, they seem to pour in liquid plaster, which has the effect of cementing them in place. These bodies in the late PPNA, at the end of the PPNA, are not going anywhere. So there's been a big shift in the relationship of the dead and the landscape and the nature of sedentism, perhaps, and settlement. So I think what we're looking at very briefly is in the PPNA, we're still dealing with some sort of animist worldview or ontology. The dead were still accessible. The dead represented the community. You could still go and talk to the dead, but they very clearly weren't individuals. You weren't talking to a specific ancestor. And certainly not markers for individual households. So we're definitely at this point much more in the sort of hunter-gatherer society and worldview than later on. So thank you very much.